Hey, I'm Cornelis. Welcome to Your Band is a Business. Today I'm going to react to a video by Rick Beato called The Death of Genre. Is this another old man rant, or does he have a nuanced opinion about this topic? I'm going to watch and listen to what he has to say and give my own opinion about this topic.
So I'm driving my 11-year-old Layla to school the other day, and she said, "Can we listen to Loive?" If you don't know who that is, well, I'll just play you the song.
Okay, so I'm going to skip forward because he plays some music. Basically, it's a new song that has a bossa nova feel, and he compares it to The Girl from Ipanema, which is a song that came out in the 1950s, I think. I don't know, last century anyway. Anyway, he notices the similarity between this new song, relatively new song, and this very old song, and then he asks the question,
Composer. So I thought to myself, what musical era are we even in here in almost 2025? What I mean by that is, historically, each era had a defining sound or cultural movement, like swing in the 30s and 40s, rock and roll in the 50s and 60s, or even the MTV-driven pop music of the 80s, or one of my favorite eras, grunge or alternative rock.
Okay, so I think we always have to be careful when we look at the past and try to compartmentalize things and put things into neat little boxes. It's a natural human inclination to want to do that. We will look at the past and we think, okay, we measure the way that we measure time in years, and the numbers that we use can then influence the way we think about it. So we think, okay, all the years that start with 195, they must have something in common. We call them the 50s, so they must have something in common. The same with the 60s or the 70s. But if you actually look at what was happening, it's not so clearly defined. So the rock and roll, you could argue, didn't really start until the mid 1950s, and it ran until the mid 60s. Whereas when we think of the 60s, we're actually thinking about what happened from 1963 or 1964 until 71, 72, 73. So it kind of breaks down. So we always have to be careful about the way that we compartmentalize things and divide things up. That, you know, there's reality and then there's the way that we describe it, and we shouldn't confuse the two things. It's useful to look at the world in the past and try and describe things, but we have to be careful that we don't equate the two. They are two different things after all.
Of the 90s. This was because mass media, meaning radio, TV, MTV, print media, was all coordinated with major labels which controlled the distribution channels of the music to create dominant narratives.
Okay, so was this happening at the time, or is this something that we are doing in hindsight? Because I'm not sure that in the 1960s, yes, that was a high point for mass media from the 60s until the 80s. But at the time, they weren't thinking of themselves as like, oh, this is the 60s. And maybe there were posters that said, oh, it's the swinging 60s or something like that. I don't know. But it's only in hindsight that you can start to look for commonalities, right? So yes, the record labels were influential and they were using mass media, whether it's the radio or print or television, to push the artists and the bands that they had signed. But and they were creating narratives around that. They were using PR, definitely, but did it extend as far as genres? Because I'm not sure that people even conceived of genres the way that we do now. I don't know.
So that you would have these ubiquitous artists and songs. If you think of someone like Sting, Every Breath You Take, that song was known by everyone, which made it easier to label the era by a few breakout genres or styles.
So something that we have to be careful of as well is that people have their own biases and interests, right? So yes, I'm sure that in the 80s, most people in the Western world, so Europe, North America, perhaps South America as well, would have been aware of Sting. But outside of that, in Africa, in Asia, I'm sure most people would have never heard of Sting before. And even to this day, if you go to countries in Africa or countries in China, they do not know about the huge celebrities that we know in the quote-unquote West, however you want to label it. Europe, North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand. So we have to be careful about our own biases, but it happens in terms of where we live and where we grew up, but also our interests, right? So if you ask somebody to think of the music of the 1970s, one person might think of what we now call classic rock, like Led Zeppelin and Queen and the Rolling Stones, but somebody else might think of the funk music and the R&B bands of that era. So it really depends on what you're into. Now, I could agree that there were probably 5 to 10 of these like big genres that kind of a lot of music fit into, and I'm sure you could argue that the record companies were fostering this idea, but I think even from the beginning of the 20th century and throughout human history, but if we're talking about pop music from the 20th century onwards, even back then there was cross-pollination between different genres. Jazz, blues, and country music were mixing, and reggae and rock were mixing in the 70s, and dance music mixed with rock music in the 80s, and then rap and rock mixed in the 90s and 2000s. So there's always been mixing, and I don't know what the relationship between record companies controlling the narrative, how that relates to genres or the death of genre, as it were. Maybe he will go into that later. Let's see.
Take a style like grunge. What does grunge sound like? Grunge is heavy, low-tuned guitars, introspective, dark lyrics, really natural-sounding instruments, and great singers like Kurt.
Okay, I'm just going to forward because, yes, he is playing some music. So he mentions Kurt Cobain from Nirvana and Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam and Lane Staley from Alice in Chains and Chris Cornell from Soundgarden. And he uses them as examples of great singers from the grunge bands of the 1990s.
An aesthetic as well. Think of things from thrift stores, flannel shirts, band t-shirts, ripped jeans, sweaters like Kurt Cobain would wear, or combat boots. These were all...
Okay, so now he's talking about the fashion of that particular scene. So I guess what Rick is talking about so far in this video is how in the past, because of mass media, there were these cultural movements that people were aware of and possibly plugged into, both as a listener and as a creator. And I guess I could agree with that. At the big macro level, that was definitely happening. But where do these genres come from? They come from micro genres, right? Or just a band that has different influences, or a pop artist that has different influences. So I'm not sure if the fact that the past was an era of mass media and big record labels, I'm not sure if the fact that we are no longer in that time period means that genres are no longer a thing, because genres are still a thing, even though mass media is not as influential, even though the big record labels are not as influential, genres are still a thing. Okay, maybe there's not the 5 to 10 big genres that 90% of music falls into. I'm not sure if that was ever the case, but let's go along with it. But yeah, I don't see how genres are no longer a thing.
All things that were associated with the style of grunge. Okay, so when was the last definable era? To me, it would be the late 90s, early 2000s pop acts like...
Okay, so he talks about the pop music from that time period. Again, you have to be aware of the fact that not everyone was into that, right? So in the late 90s, early 2000s, So dance music was still really big in Europe and UK. I don't know about North America, but dance music was huge in the 90s, huge in the 2000s. In the late 90s and 2000s, we had the indie era of the Strokes and the Killers and loads of UK bands, and new metal was a thing during that time, Limp Bizkit and Korn and all that kind of stuff. So can you look at that time period and say, oh yeah, that was the time of pop music? I mean, it was big, but pop has been big for a long time, right? It's the era of Max Martin, so it's interesting from that point of view. But yeah, I think we should be careful about looking at the past and trying to fit it into a box, because it helps us create a story. I mean, that's what humans do. I understand we are always trying to make sense of the world around us. We're always trying to make sense of the past. We're always trying to make it fit together logically and spin a story around it, when the truth is there's a lot of randomness.
Dominant musical era. Here's an interesting fact. In 1999, record sales reached their peak when 600 million people spent an average of $64 on records, achieving $40 billion in sales of recorded music. That's insane.
By the way, it's always interesting to hear about the amount of money that's involved in the music industry, because those are big numbers, right? But compared to a lot of other industries, the music industry, even at its peak, has always been kind of a small industry compared to the fashion industry, for example, or manufacturing, like car manufacturing or transportation or things like that. And to some people that might be an obvious thing, but to others they might be surprised, because I think when it comes to the entertainment industry, the movie industry, the music industry, there is a lot of glamour involved, and people look at that industry as an example of people making loads of money. But when you compare it to a lot of other industries, the music industry, even at its peak, was kind of a small thing, really. It just has a lot of glamour associated with it.
So what was the turning point that ended these dominant genres of music? To me, it was the internet and streaming. It was things like Napster, the iTunes Store, Spotify, YouTube. All of these things acted as a disruptor or disruptive force that changed the way that people discovered and consumed music.
Okay, so I don't understand how the fact that the way people discover and consume music means that that genres are dying, because listening to music and discovering music is different from creating music. Now, I will agree that the type of music that people are making is influenced by what they listen to. So I can agree with the fact, well, okay, if we are coming out of a mass media era into a personalized social media and algorithmic driven era, then that means that people will be influenced, or can potentially be influenced, by different types of music, because they can much more easily expose themselves to different kinds of music. So that gives the opportunity to be influenced by more different types of music, which means that they will create different types of music. So you have the rise of, I guess, micro genres, and then there's potentially an audience out there. The long tail audience exists for these particular types of music. But I think, yes, so on the one hand, the death of mass media contributes to that, but I don't think it's the defining reason. I think the other big thing that is happening is that people can much more easily create different types of music with the technology available. So laptops, phones, tablets. Back in the day, if you wanted to make music, well, you have to buy some instruments and start a band, or perhaps later if you want to create hip hop music, you have to buy a sampler and some turntables, and it's hard to cross over, right? You might only have enough money to buy a guitar or for turntables, and rarely are people going to do both. But then over the decades, the technology became more affordable, and the rise of laptops and phones and tablets, that now means that people can create music that has influences from different genres, and also they can create music on their own, so there's less of a need to compromise with other people. So the music that is being created is more it shows the individual taste of the creator, which has its upsides and downsides, because it is a great thing that to be forced to collaborate with other people sometimes, because that means that you are combining your tastes with that of somebody else, and that's how you often get something new and interesting. And I don't think it's a coincidence that many artists that leave a band and go become solo artists, often their music is not as interesting, because the interesting music actually happened because of the combination of several different people, each contributing their own skills and their own tastes. And if it's just one person, then well, it's just their influences, and it can become a bit one-dimensional. Not all the time, but it does happen a lot. So yeah, at the moment in this video, I think Rick Beato is kind of talking about a couple of different things, and I'm not entirely sure that those things are directly responsible for the death of genres.
It relied on algorithmic playlists and global distribution, which gave equal footing to niche artists and micro genres. The result was that no single dominant or must-hear genre movement was able to flourish, because listeners followed their personal taste curation rather than mass consensus.
Okay, but it's a chicken and egg situation, and but I think there's more. It comes more from the fact that the music creators are able to be more diverse in terms of the influences that they take on board and the music that they create, because it's not the listeners that are creating micro genres, it's the musicians and music producers that are creating the micro genres, if you want to go along with that narrative. So the listeners do provide positive feedback, because they might have niche tastes that are now being served that were not as easily served in the past. So the music creators are getting more encouragement, but it's not the listeners that are creating the genres, it's the music creators.
Consensus was created by things like having a 3-month window in which the record is set up. All records were set up with this 3-month period. You release a single, you'd go to press 3 months ahead of time, you'd be in all these magazines, you'd have your video hit on MTV, everything would happen at once, and you would build that consensus, and everyone was hearing this record all at the same time. In today's musical landscape, there are countless subgenres that exist in parallel. Bedroom pop, lo-fi beats, hyperpop, neo-soul revival, niche metal scenes like progressive metal, and each of them have their own dedicated fan bases.
Right, so yeah, again, I think Rick is kind of conflating different historical movements, occurrences, trends, as it were, the death of mass media, the rise of social media and individualized, personalized, algorithmic-led media. That is certainly a thing, but at the end of the day, these micro genres that he mentioned, they are created by musicians, and yes, they are now less, because they are not growing up in a mass media environment, they will be more inclined to be influenced by different things. But I think musicians or anybody that is creative, on the whole, I think studies show this, creative people are interested in original things, new ideas, whether that's different types of food, or traveling to countries to interact with different cultures. And the same with music. I think musicians on the whole always have been interested in quote unquote new stuff, right? So it's just now that it's it's easier to listen to music from all around the world. It's easier, as I said, with the help of technology, to actually create that music. In the past, you didn't have so many options. You only had so much money. You had to pick and choose your lane. You had to find people to make music with. Now people can do it all on their own. And yes, the death of mass media means that there is a long tail of people out there that are potentially interested in what you have to make.
Because today there's really no unifying broadcast platform like we had with radio and MTV that forced this collective experience for listeners. So really now we're in what I would call a post-genre world, where artists openly blend styles like rap and country, or jazz chords and R&B, or electronic music and rock, blurring the boundaries of these specific genres. And genre labels feel increasingly outdated, replaced really by mood-based or influencer, I hate that word, influencer-driven curation.
Again, I feel like he's conflating different things, because on the one hand, he talks about how different styles of music are able to be influenced, or take in so many different influences that you can't even really use certain words to label types of music. But then then he talks about how influencers are driving the attention towards certain types of music. So again, there's a difference between how people discover music, how people consume music, and how they create it. And obviously the people that create music started out as listeners, and they have been influenced by different kinds of music. But the fact that there are mood-based playlists, or playlists created by influencers, does not mean that genres are not a thing anymore. I think that's a separate conversation.
Industry success metrics now reflect broad, varied tastes, where you can have massive global hits that people don't know. When I did my video on Blinding Lights, it's the most streamed song on Spotify. There's so many people that say, I've never even heard that song. I know so many people that have never heard a Taylor Swift song. They know who she is. They don't know any of her music. I just did this video where I mentioned Mr. Beast, the biggest person on this platform. Half the comments are like, I don't know who that is. So are we between eras, or is this the new normal? It's possible that we're in a transitional phase, the algorithmic age, where discovery is personalized rather than collective. But
yeah, so I understand what he's talking about here. I've had this experience where a friend of mine went to see a band playing at Wembley Arena, which is one of the biggest venues in London, and it's a rock band, and I'd never heard of them. Now, the thing is, obviously, I can't know about every single band in the world, but it's surprising to me that a band can, from my point of view, come out of nowhere and just play Wembley Arena without me having ever heard of them. So and that's happened multiple times where bands and artists are playing quite big venues, and I think, who are they? Like I said, nobody could be expected to know about all the millions of underground artists and bands around the world playing at small venues. But in my mind, when you get to a certain size, then you would expect to have heard of them in passing. But no, we're definitely not in that type of world anymore. So I agree with him from that point of view.
For now, we're living through a moment where each listener can curate their own mini era, I guess, where there's no particular dominant sound, just a galaxy of possibilities. Love to know your thoughts. Hit the subscribe button, leave a comment. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so what can we take away from what Rick has to say in terms of us as independent artists, because there's a couple of different things that he's talking about, and I'm not sure what it has to do with the title of the video, The Death of Music Genres. But anyway, as independent musicians, the takeaway for me is that we should be much more confident in the type of music that we make and not feel like we have to fit a preconceived genre. Okay, he talked about music discovery and all of that, but the point I think that we can learn there is that people are not coming to a music platform and thinking, oh, I'm only going to listen to metal, or I'm only going to listen to hip hop. They are just looking for good songs, and they will have what we would traditionally call hip hop elements or metal elements, but they're not going to freak out if there's some other kind of production or instrumentation involved that has been borrowed from other types of music. So yeah, as independent musicians, I think we should be very confident in creating the music that we want to, and because of the internet, because of technology, there is an audience out there. So if you like something, then you can be pretty confident that there will be hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of people out there that will like the same thing that you do. So yeah, be confident in the type of music that you're making. Don't feel like you have to fit certain preconceptions from the past. Just put it out there, find your audience, because more than likely it does exist. So it's an interesting video from Rick as a jumping off point to discuss some things. Like I said, I felt a bit confused about why the fact that mass media isn't a thing anymore would necessarily mean that genres aren't a thing anymore. Like I said, I think there is definitely I think it's easier to find music that fits particular styles, that very niche interests. So you could say, okay, that those are micro genres, however you want to call it. I just think maybe a better way of describing what's going on is that it is easier as a creator to reach that long tail audience, that niche audience, which you think is niche because you're the only person in the world that is really into the crossover between reggae and country bluegrass music or whatever. But it turns out there's a million people around the world that are just dying for that kind of music. So be confident in what you're creating, put it out there and find your audience.